Well, thanks everyone for joining. I'm here today with Dr. Jessica Bloom. She's an accomplished clinician and researcher in pediatric rheumatology. She's a colleague and a friend, and she's also a person who was diagnosed with MS a few years ago. And so her thoughts and her journey, we thought would be valuable as we talk about some of the silent symptoms, the multiple sclerosis. So thanks for being part of this.
Thanks for having me.
If you could, tell us a bit about your journey into the diagnosis of MS and some of the symptoms you've had over time.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed back in February 2021. So doing the math, I was about 31 years old. And for me, it started with what I didn't know was MS, of course, at the time, but I had a lot of numbness and tingling. And I actually thought that I had slept, I knew I'd slept on my side for about 10 days because I had a small procedure on my back. And I thought maybe I slept weird and my arm went numb. And so, of course, then I let it go on for a couple months. And sometimes you know too much. And I thought, oh, nerves take time to heal when you sleep weird. And so I gave that time. I finally saw my primary care provider who did order an MRI without contrast of my neck, and it was for about a week later. And in that week's time, I started to develop numbness in my leg, the bottom of my face, and to my trunk. And so that's when I started to think either I have something like multiple sclerosis or I am an anxious mess who is believing that you have symptoms you don't have, or a brain tumor. I mean, the list was going in my brain. And so I went to get the MRI the next morning. With technology now, it just resulted on my phone. So I'm sitting on my couch and there I goes opening the MRI, and it said that I had lesions, most likely something like MS. So I was very emotional. I called my friends from residency, including you and your colleagues who I trained with, to get some insight, and ended up going to the emergency department. I had more imaging, lumbar puncture, was ultimately diagnosed, had pulse dose IV steroids, and started on rituximab. And so when I was diagnosed, I had one inactive lesion in my C-spine and then an active lesion in my C-spine, as well as an inactive lesion in my thoracic spine, which, looking back, I remembered that during COVID, I actually, everyone was walking just constantly. And whenever I'd walk, my heels and feet would fall asleep. And I just always thought, maybe I'm like sitting too much, I'm losing circulation, or these shoes aren't good. And I just ignored it because it was invisible. I didn't know. I just thought my feet kept flying asleep. And looking back, I think that was one of my first signs that I was having an episode.
It sounds like some of those early symptoms, some of those invisible symptoms, were kind of difficult for you, even as a physician who's very knowledgeable about many autoimmune diseases. Like, it was tough for you to conceptualize what that was, or what that meant.
Yeah, it's really hard when you read these things in a textbook to then envision them in your own life. And I think I saw, I knew there's patterns in the brain and the spine, but it's very complicated. There's a reason you specialize to learn more about it. And it was a lot to process. I at times felt like I knew too much and it would make me more worried, or maybe I knew a lot but in a totally wrong field. And so it helped to rely on my peers, but I recognize that not everyone has that option.
Pause real quick.
One thing that really struck a chord with me when I was diagnosed was I kept finding myself comparing my symptoms to someone else's. And I think of my friends growing up and their parents who maybe had a wheelchair or a walker or an assistive device to go up the stairs. And then I saw myself who my symptoms are numbness, tingling, maybe balance, and proprioception, like knowing where my hands are and knocking things over. And I sort of saw that as less. And then I would think, like, but do I really have MS? Like, I know I have the disease, but should I lump myself in this category of people who may be suffering more or are more disabled? And then I couldn't really let myself accept the diagnosis. I'd watch videos of people talking about their stories, and I couldn't decide if I relate or not. And so that took a while to really accept that you're allowed to accept that you have a diagnosis, no matter the degree of it. I'm still on medication that takes away a large majority or part of my immune system, and it's still something that I think about every day. So that was a struggle, I think, when I was diagnosed, knowing that my symptoms, if I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know.
Sounds like having those invisible symptoms has made it a lot more difficult for you to like accept yourself as part of that group, or accept that other people will accept you as part of that group.
Or I have family, friends reaching out, and you tell them you have MS, and it's this whole big reaction, and I find myself comforting them almost and explaining it to them. But I think also I want to be like, oh yeah, I have MS, but it's like mild. And maybe there is some validity to that, but it's still a disease that affects me every day. I think there's a couple ways to look at invisible symptoms. There's pros and cons, and I think a pro is if you want to assimilate into society and activities you're trying to do, it's not like you're wearing a sign that's going to tell people you may have limitations. But at the same time, it can be challenging to have something that is not recognized unless you actually share that information. So it's sort of like the burden falls on me to enlighten others that I might be struggling, or as much as I want to be strong and tough, I'm still human, and maybe I want someone to say, like, I'm sorry that while we're having this conversation, you're also thinking about how your foot's asleep and your arm feels weird. And instead, I don't know if I should say something because it doesn't help the situation, but a little empathy and support is also helpful. So it's that fine line of not wanting a pity party, but wanting to be acknowledged for the strength that you've gained to get through this and the daily struggle.
Yeah, that seems like a difficult balance to be able to find. Like you said, you want the recognition of what you've accomplished and what you accomplish every day, but also the burden or the fatigue of trying to educate others too. And I've had a number of patients who've told me of kind of difficulties with kind of disclosing MS or disability to their work too, and kind of how that shouldn't change anything except for the better and more support for them, but it still changes things in ways that they don't have the same control over.
Another thing I think about with invisible symptoms that makes it hard is how do you really explain it to people, but particularly your healthcare provider, and then even to yourself. So it's a lot easier for me to say, I have a rash, show you the rash and see the rash myself. But if I just have the sense that maybe my legs feel different or a different part of my leg's affected, before I even bring it up to someone else, like my healthcare provider, I go through a cycle of questioning myself. Am I imagining this? Maybe I exercise too much and it's just feeling that way. And then you call and you're asked, oh, are you dehydrated? Are you tired? Were you sick? Are you stressed? And I mean, who isn't all of those things most of the time? It's hard to sort of balance the risk of not saying something. You're risking your spinal cord and your brain, but also wanting to be responsible and try to remember, like, what's a pseudo flare and a flare, and then what's my baseline? And it's just a lot. I think the mental burden in general is a lot. I have to know which vaccines I'm supposed to get. I think mental burden is an invisible symptom in its own. You have, what vaccine should I get? What appointments do I need? I've had to change medications because of my insurance, and I spend maybe 2 weeks of my life talking to the copay program and then the insurance people and which pharmacy, and it's just a lot that you have to process in everyday situations. What social events are you going to go to because now you want to think about a pandemic and all of that. So I think that is an invisible symptom that probably everyone with MS can share.
One of the other kind of very common invisible symptoms I hear about is fatigue, both kind of a physical fatigue and kind of like a cognitive fatigue. Have you experienced any of those since you've been diagnosed?
Yes. And I think even that's been a journey to accept that I'm feeling that. I know who isn't tired, and fatigue is such a generic term that can come with mental health and so many other reasons to be fatigued. I think I've struggled to really tease that out, which goes back to that self-doubt and questioning of myself. But when I think about fatigue, I feel like it's very hard to explain, but those who experience it understand. It's like I might have slept great and I'm just sitting doing work, and then suddenly it's like I have this weighted blanket over my eyes and I want to be awake, I want to be working, and I just can't keep my eyes open. I just feel like all I could do is sit back, fall asleep sitting up, take a power nap. And so it sort of hits when you don't expect it. And I think also after you've been in the heat, which a lot of us can't help depending where you live, and you might power walk to a meeting because you're running late in the heat, and then you get there and then suddenly you just feel this wave of decreased energy, and it can be really hard to push through. It's also one of those things that you can't really explain, and then you don't know how to navigate that, where you feel tired, well, so do they were up with their child, and it just, as you said, there's this physical fatigue and then there's that mental fatigue, and I think I can tell the difference of when my brain's just not processing at its normal speed and when my body needs a break.
What are some of the things that you found that helps with either of those things that have worked for you?
Yeah, I think one thing I found is not fighting it, which we don't always have the opportunity to do. But if I'm home and I feel this, I just try to push through, and I'm literally typing and I'm just falling asleep every other word. And sometimes I just have to let myself take a break. You can set a timer, let my eyes close, and just get that refresh, which can be really helpful. I think otherwise prioritizing sleep as much as you can. And one thing that I find helpful that I hear people talk about is something called the spoon theory, but essentially is everyone's given a certain amount of spoons in their day, and maybe for someone walking to that meeting and rushing to that meeting takes 1 spoon of their allotment, and maybe for me or someone else that takes 3, and we only have so many spoons in the day. So I think planning ahead and knowing some activity is going to use up more of the energy bank that I'm allotted each day is helpful in terms of pre-planning and just setting your expectations. I think it's one thing to hear about all these symptoms and know what's expected and what's not, but it's another to have to actually process that debate in your head every day and not just feel disappointed. Like, I know something might leave me more tired, but then it's how do you deal with that and respond to that? I think for me, it's sort of a question of acceptance. I think you have to accept that this is something that is true. This is a fact. We unfortunately can't take away the disease, but we can also accept that it's okay to be disappointed. It's okay that that's not ideal and that you need to get comfort sometimes. It's okay to be nervous, and also accepting that it's a journey. You might not be able to accept or be okay with those things today or tomorrow, or maybe you are, but then you go a little backwards. But I think having support systems that understand you're going to ebb and flow will be really helpful for that. I think for me, I'm a little anxious at baseline, and I think this just adds to that. And so some things I have to work on is, one, I'm all for having a therapist and seeking mental health support just for an outside person to know I can discuss these things with. There's always that balance with my husband of I want to complain, I want to say I'm worried about something, but I also don't want him to then worry that I'm going to get worse or this is going to be a problem. So there's that fine line. So I think having an outside source can be really helpful. I find helpful using a weighted blanket can be somewhat soothing when you're stressed. And speaking of blankets, when I was diagnosed and had more active disease, and even now, I find a cooling blanket in my bed can be really helpful. So it's under me and it has cold water that runs through it, and that just helps me from waking up hot and numb. Another thing that I find helpful is just my brain is all about thinking about the unknowns, and it wants to just process it and worry. And I've learned the skill of saying, maybe that's the case or maybe it's not. And your brain sort of doesn't have anywhere else to go. So maybe you're going to struggle with that activity or maybe you're not. But unless you do it, you're not going to know. And so just trying to repeat those back to my anxious brain, and just knowing I'm accepting what's happening, but I'm committed to doing what aligns with my values, and as much as that's safe, trying to do that.
How have some of your numbness, the tingling that you had at the start, like how has some of those symptoms, how do you experience them now, and how has that affected like your day-to-day life?
I think now my baseline is sort of a way I always try to explain it is if you go to the dentist and they numb your mouth because they're gonna take out a tooth and then you leave and it has that like fuzzy feeling that it's not still fully asleep but it hasn't quite woken up. That's like if I touch my arm, that's what my whole arm feels like. And that's sort of baseline. I have that somewhat on my legs, a little on my other arm in different areas, but some worse than others. And then if I do activities like walk fast somewhere or get warm or work out or something, then I'll just feel that exacerbated. I think one example that comes to my mind is I do Pilates and I'll go to this class and so I have trouble with balance and also proprioception, so just sort of knowing where I am in space. And if I will do these balance things and the women and men next to me are doing them so well and I am just wobbling all over the place, and part of me wants to be embarrassed. I want to like make an announcement, like I have a reason that I can't do this. But at the same time, I think I've just had to learn to I have my own sense of pride that I can just say like, it's okay. You're okay to wobble around when others aren't, and maybe they're having trouble with something else for different reasons. And maybe they didn't eat breakfast and they're just more tired than normal. And I think just remembering that everyone has their different reasons for maybe not keeping up in the same way they want to, and I don't have to explain that. It's not on me to have to explain to them why I can or can't do something. Another way that I have found support during this journey is through peer support. When I first got diagnosed, it seems everybody knows someone with MS. You just have to ask enough friends and you'll find some connection. But when I got diagnosed, I was connected with a couple people, and at first it's intimidating to reach out to someone and talk to them, but getting connected was really helpful. So whether it's a mutual friend or through the Rocky Mountain MS Center, getting someone to speak to who can relate is helpful, but also remembering that everyone's different. So just because the first person I talked to had vision problems and other things doesn't mean that I will, or because I have trouble with balance doesn't mean that they will. And so not scaring each other, but finding that support and that unity is helpful.
How have the people that you've met, the peer support that you've gained, how has that helped you with kind of understanding your invisible symptoms or finding ways to help with them?
It's helped a lot. I would say even just that mental burden, that invisible thought process that's often going on in the back of our minds, having someone else to say, have you gotten that vaccine, or do I need to, or I'm trying to go on this trip but I don't know if I need to get extra medications in case. I think that's been really helpful. Even people with other diseases that have chronic illness can be someone that you can relate to. But I think also just the symptoms in general, knowing someone else gets that feeling of, I touch my own arm and sometimes I'm like surprised or just like kind of doesn't feel like me that my arm feels that way. And then I start thinking about how like that's not going to change, and so, or hopefully we'll get somewhat better, but there will be this baseline. And to have someone else who can understand that is helpful. Another helpful support for me has been my healthcare team. Having your neurologist that you trust is extremely helpful, and you want to trust your team enough to really depend on their advice, but also enough to feel comfortable that you can advocate for yourself. So I maybe will ask questions and I feel that this is a safe space to do that, but I really do rely on their knowledge and expertise. But knowing that they exist, knowing that they can connect me to other people or a social worker or other patients that I might need can be really helpful. another thing that sometimes I struggle with is how far to push myself. So I'm told for fatigue and for things that exercise is really helpful. But then if you over exercise, then you're more fatigued, and it's just hard to find that balance. And I'm still learning that. And maybe I'm fatigued because I pushed too hard, or maybe I'm fatigued because I'm not doing enough. And that balance has been a little tricky to
That adds
navigate.
even more to the cognitive
Yeah.
burden.
Yeah, exactly.